So I am the coordinator for Restorative Justice, as Kellis said. I've been at Oakland Unified School District for I'm going on 10 years now, and been doing restorative justice here the whole entire time. Before that, just so you kind of have an idea of my background, I've been doing conflict resolution. I come out of the conflict resolution field, and I managed conflict resolution programs at a lot of nonprofits. So my background really is in group facilitation, conflict resolution, organizational transformation, that kind of thing. And I've been doing that for over 20 years now, and with almost 10 of those years here at OUSD. So the first thing I want to say is Happy Teacher Appreciation Week. I appreciate all of you as a co-worker and colleague, but also as a parent of two teenage daughters. And so I very much appreciate you. You are my heroes, and I'm not just saying that, I mean it. And so happy Teacher Appreciation Week. And also I just want to give a brief shout out to Montgomery County, Maryland Public Schools, because someone from there reached out to me earlier a couple of weeks ago, and wanted to see what kind of resources we were putting together for online learning. And she ended up giving me a ton of resources, more than I was able to offer her. So some of the stuff in this presentation is from them. And her name is Asashia Martin, by the way, and Montgomery County, Maryland Public Schools. So let's see, how am I going to get to the next? There it is. All right, so some of the tools and the tips that we're going to be giving you today are things that you can use in Circle online. They're things that we can do in Circle when we're with each other, but I'm hoping to discuss with you how to move those online. And this is an example of a tool you can use to create a mindful moment with your students or the staff or whoever you're doing a circle with. And it's a way for people to visually focus on something that will help them regulate. So I'm just going to give us a few moments here to follow the prompts here in this circle and do some breathing. So at your own pace, go ahead. And one more. Okay, thank you for participating in that. Hopefully you feel a little bit more regulated, a little more grounded, a little more present in this space, which is always the reason for an opening. We always do openings in our circles, and it's to create an intentional space. And so hopefully you feel like you've arrived. Also just wanted to add this quote, which I just really love. I think it is appropriate in the field of education. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He wrote The Little Prince as well. I believe it's a he, I'm not sure, but author of The Little Prince. Okay. So the purpose of this webinar is really to help you think about circles that you may have been doing in your classroom already, if you've been practicing restorative justice, and how we can move them online. Because really the goal of restorative practices is to build and maintain community. A lot of people think of RJ or RP as dealing with harm and conflict, and it certainly is that. But really the goal is to build and maintain community, and that becomes the jumping off point for everything else. Excuse me. So while we are not physically present with each other in our schools, how do we maintain community? How do we maintain connection? How do we keep those relationships going? And not just going, but flourishing as well. So that's really the goal of this today. Here's our agenda. We just did an opening. We're not going to really do a check-in. I was going to have us do a check-in in breakout groups, but that's something that you can do in your own circles, in your Zoom sessions with your students or other people you're going to be doing circles with, is to use the breakout feature on Zoom to do check-ins. And you can do check-ins with just 2 people arbitrarily, or you can assign them, or you can do 4 people and give them a little bit more time. And then we're going to do a poll on our experience, just a yes or no with experience of RJ. I'm going to do a primer on RJ philosophy and how we roll it out here at OUSD. I want to talk a little bit about trauma. If you work at OUSD, you probably or hopefully had some PD on trauma already and how it impacts adults as well as young people and learning, in particular teaching and learning. I think it's important to talk about it today in the context of restorative practices and virtual learning, because there is a lot of trauma that we are experiencing on a daily basis right now. And so I want to just talk about that and how it might impact us as we do remote learning together. And then we'll talk about some tips and tools and things that I've learned along the way. And by along the way, I mean in the last few weeks. And then we'll close. And that is a good segue for me to say that I am by no means an expert in online restorative practices, and I don't want to pretend to be that for you today. I think I'm here to offer what I've learned, some insights based on my experience as a restorative justice practitioner in schools, and some things that we've learned, and by we I mean me and the restorative justice facilitators and the RJ program managers and other folks I've spoken to, around how to bring this very personal relational process online and how to do that. And so we'll be talking about that. So right now, Kelleth is going to send out a poll to you all. And the question is simply a yes or no question. Have you had any RJ experience or training? We'll just click yes. Okay. And so I just want to get an idea of how many folks that are here. It looks like there's how many? 31 or 32 people here. How many have had some RJ trainings or experience? It's totally fine if you've had none. Everyone is welcome, all levels of experience. The one thing I've learned about the more I do restorative justice, the more I realize how much I have to learn. And I try to keep a beginner's mindset with all the RJ work I do. And I take as my model John Coltrane, the great jazz saxophone player, because there are stories of him running scales, basic, major, and minor scales. People could hear him in his hotel room. He's widely considered one of the greatest saxophone players that ever lived, but there's stories of him just running very basic scales all the way up into his later years and even just right before he died. And so what that tells me is that he kept a beginner's mindset. He kept open to learning and never felt like he was too good or too much of a master at playing to not just always do the basics. So I try to keep my chops up. I try to keep a beginner's mindset. I hope you would too. So that is to say that if there's anything I go over today that you feel you've already learned, I would just ask you and encourage you to keep an open mind about it. And maybe there's some things that will be new for you. And for those of you that are new to restorative justice or haven't had much experience with it, I would just ask you to keep an open mind to what we'll be going over today. So Kelleth, do we have any results? Survey says, okay, yes, 61% say yes, they've had restorative justice training experience, and 39% say no. Great, so that's good to know, and I appreciate all of you for participating in the poll, and you are all welcome here. All right, there we go. So before we go any further, it's really important that we ground ourselves in some foundational principles. And these are some foundational principles that we came up with here at OUSD in our restorative justice work that we do around the district, supporting creating a community of learners in our district. And so I'll just give you a second to kind of read through this, and briefly we'll go over it. The first one, there is simply no substitute for the personal. That's about relationships. A district can be a transactional place, and we're about moving it towards a relational space where we are in relationship with each other, and a priority for us is building and maintaining those relationships, okay? Nothing about us without us. That's about equity, that's about inclusion, and making sure that people impacted or affected by a decision are included in that decision. I'm willing to do this. Participation is voluntary. We can't force people to be in circle. If a student, for some reason or another, we don't know what they've been through earlier that day or that week or that year, they don't want to participate, then we don't make them do it, as long as they're not disruptive. And I find that most students aren't. Some students need to just go chill out in a little peace corner, or do something else. But most students will participate, especially if it's meaningful and the topic is relevant to them and something they want to discuss. Here's where we get into some tier 2, some harm and conflict. If crime hurts, justice should heal. So healing happens in restorative justice via accountability. So when someone is accountable for their actions in a way that is relevant to what happened, meaning they meet the needs of the impacted parties, including themselves, because in restorative justice, harmed people harm people. And so there's a need there originally that created the harm, right? What was the harm that led to this person to harm another? And so we feel that instead of punishing people, that the goal is to create healing, to reweave the fabric of the relationships or the community that has been broken as a result of whatever the incident is, okay? So accountability via healing, or maybe I should say healing via accountability. And then lastly, this can work, I can live with it. That basically means we make consensual decisions. Unless we're purposely voting on something, most of the decisions, if not all of them, in circle are made consensually. Okay, so moving right along. This is a great way to think about restorative justice in the context of criminal justice, okay? Now, restorative justice came out of indigenous philosophy and practice into the criminal justice field as an alternative. And if you look on the left-hand side there, you'll see retributive justice. That's our modern justice system today. And really, we ask 3 questions. What rule or what was the law that was broken? Who did it? And then what are we going to do to them? How are we going to punish them? It's exclusionary, it's isolationist, and it doesn't provide healing, like what we were just talking about. So that's also how our school discipline systems tend to work in our country. And so restorative justice started to become popular in the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s. It came sort of reinvented in the modern context from the Maori people in New Zealand and spread around the world from there. And in the 90s started to come into schools and became much more popular in the mid 2000s, late 2010 area. And so the way to think about it is, instead of thinking about what law was broken, who did it, and how are we going to punish them, or what are we going to do to them, think about it in terms of the harm that was done, not the law that was broken, not the rule that was broken, but what was the harm that was caused by this event or this incident, and to whom? And again, what was the original harm that caused this person to harm another person or to harm a group? Okay, what are the resulting needs? Because every harm creates needs, right? And then what are the obligations to make it right as best as possible? And sometimes you just can't make it right as, all the way. So you have to make it right as best as possible. And how should all the affected parties come together to decide how to repair this harm, right? So restorative justice is about harms, needs, and obligations, as opposed to, what are we going to do to this person that broke this rule, okay? So that's these questions were developed by a person named Howard Zehr, who was a professor at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and he wrote a book called Changing Lenses. He's also a photographer, and that was sort of the seminal work on restorative justice. And he has since wrote other books, most notably the one called The Little Book of Restorative Justice, which is a small book that you can read on a primer on restorative justice. So let's see. I don't have my chat up, so I can't see, because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see if there's any questions. So I'm just going to keep going and see if I can find a time to answer questions later. I want to talk about a little bit about rollout in schools and in OUSD in particular, okay? So I sort of gave you a general sort of primer on what RJ is in terms of harms, needs, and obligations, that it is from an indigenous, non-dominant perspective, and that it's grounded in some principles that I told you earlier. So many of you may have heard about MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or perhaps you've heard of response to intervention, often referred to as RTI. That is how we scaffold restorative practices or restorative justice here in Oakland Unified School District. It's a way of scaffolding or framing the work, a very holistic paradigm in something that's kind of understandable in education. So tier 1 is about social and emotional support. It's about connection, and that's mostly what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, it's about doing circles in your classroom to build community, to create a safe space where students feel they can be vulnerable, where they can begin to heal if they need to heal from something, and to do it safely so that they can learn. Okay, our restorative conversation is a conversation with a student, sort of informal, about what happened and what they were thinking, and who's been impacted by a behavior. And it can be had with an adult as well. It's not just about students. Restorative justice is not about doing to students, it's about doing with. So tier 2 is what most people think of when they think of restorative justice or restorative practices. I use those terms interchangeably, by the way. My t-shirt says OUSD restorative practices. We also say restorative justice. But tier 2 is about harm and conflict. This year, we've trained approximately 450 students across OUSD at all of our schools to use the circle process and the RJ philosophy to heal harm and conflict. And we also teach them to do tier 1 as well in their classrooms. And many of them may be doing tier 1 with you in your classrooms, meaning leading circles, facilitating circles to build community. And then tier 3 is about reentry. It's about supporting one person, whether it's a student or an adult. And an example of a tier 3 would be a student who's new to your school, coming in the middle of the year, or maybe they've been expelled and are returning, or they're a newcomer student who is new to the school, and we want to just welcome them and their family to the school community. It really just makes sense to do that and determine what they need to be successful and move through, matriculate. Another example might be if a teacher is pregnant and needs to go on maternity leave in, say, February, a great way to transition her into, out of the classroom and into the last part of her pregnancy would be to do a circle with her. And then maybe do a welcome circle for the new teacher coming in to help them understand what's, how the class rolls, what's going on in the class, what's important, what are the values in that classroom, that kind of thing. So that's how we roll it out. That's the model that we've developed here to scaffold restorative justice. Now, again, restorative justice is a holistic paradigm based on a philosophy and a set of practices. This is an easy way to understand it. I want to make sure you know that we do not define restorative justice by these 3 tiers. It's just a very simple and easy way that educators can understand for us to describe it. Okay. Okay. Let's go back one. I'm just going to look and see if I can get to the chat. Okay, looks like I'm seeing the chat here. Okay. Shout out to Kella. Yep, Kella's doing a great job. I've had the best RJ experiences with leaders at Edna Brewer. Edna Brewer is a thriving restorative justice site. Thank you for embracing restorative justice at Edna Brewer. Love that. I'm sorry that your Chromebook's audio is echoing. I'm not sure what to do about that. Okay, Michelle Campbell-Mateo, shout out to you. All right, let me move on. I could get caught up saying hi to everybody on chat because I am also a very relational person. And so, but let me talk a little bit about trauma, restorative practices, and why it's important right now during this time, the time of COVID-19. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but it is very important to understand. And my hope, like I said in the beginning, is that all of you, since you work at OUSD, have been able to attend some professional learning on trauma and how it impacts young people as well as ourselves, and how to consider it when teaching and learning, okay? So many students come into our classroom in fight, flight, or freeze mode because they've experienced some sort of trauma, okay? And what's not happening when someone is in fight, flight, or freeze mode, whether it's a student or a teacher, is learning. Trauma creates a circle of harm and aggression, a cycle, I should say, of harm and aggression. Okay, so a trauma is something that you feel has impacted your life, that you feel like either your life is in danger or it's had an impact on you emotionally. And I'm sure I'm not doing this definition justice. I'm not a social worker, but I do have some understanding of trauma and how it impacts the brain. So I'm going to give you my thoughts on that. So trauma creates a cycle of harm and aggression. So in other words, harm people, like I said earlier, right? It can also put folks into this mode of fight, flight, or freeze, where your prefrontal cortex right here, where you organize, plan, make decisions, starts to go offline. And so a lot of behavior in the classroom that might be seen as disruptive or even, quote, defiant, is actually just someone that has been experiencing trauma, and it's their way of coping with it. It might be hoodie up, head down, tapping a pencil incessantly, getting up, walking around. And a trauma can be re-triggered by all kinds of things, including a sight, a sound, a smell, all kinds of things. And so it's impossible for us to know everyone's triggers. But what we can do is try and be as conscious as possible about behavior and if it's an indicator of trauma. Okay, so if someone is in your classroom or in your school community and they're in fight, flight, or freeze mode, what's not happening is learning. Okay, let me see if I can. There we go. So that's why it's important that we create spaces in our classrooms where students can feel safe, first and foremost, where they can feel connected to each other, where they feel like they create shared values together, where their values are present in the classroom. It's not just the adults' values, but it's their classroom as well. Their values are present, their culture is present, because values are an indicator of your culture, right? And so we want to provide the social emotional supports necessary in the classroom so that people can begin to break out of the cycle of harm and aggression that trauma can cause, because many of our students experience trauma, if not vicariously, certainly in an acute and in a complex way, meaning over time. Okay, if you look at the violent crime statistics through the city of Oakland, and then you map that with where our students live, the entire city would be covered, and therefore many of our students have experienced some of those as well as other traumatic events. So it's incumbent upon us as adults to create an environment where learning can happen, and that means first and foremost creating safety. And a restorative circle, is a great way to do that. It's one way to do that, and it's a great way to do that. When you have created a space that feels safe, where students' social and emotional learning can happen and they can access that, that's when they can begin to get into their executive functioning part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so that's what's needed to break free of this cycle of harm and aggression. And when you've given access to that executive functioning, that's when you can engage with learning. That's when they can do something like cite evidence from a text and argue a position persuasively, right? They're not going to do that if they're in flight, fight, or freeze mode. So we use circle, we use restorative practices, we use intentional, conscious relationships and creating shared values together to be able to allow students to feel like they're in a space where they can then begin to organize, plan, and do the things that the prefrontal cortex can do, and feel connected to each other. And then we can engage in learning. Okay, I hope this makes sense to all of you, but it's really important because right now I would submit to you all that we are going through a very traumatic time. And I think you would probably agree with me that there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of things happening. People are getting sick. We may know people who have passed away. We may have gotten sick ourselves. And we are losing income. We are having food security issues. And there's a lot going on that is traumatic. We are going through persistent trauma right now. And I don't want to understate that, okay? And so I'm going to ask you to use the chat box. I want to invite you to chat and kind of answer these questions for a few minutes. In what ways is our school community experiencing trauma during this time? And how does what we are going through affect learners and teachers, teaching and learning? Okay, so just put some of your answers in here in the chat and we can see what people have to say. There's a question here about how does restorative practices fit into the typical school day? You know, it really depends on the school environment. It depends on if it's elementary, middle, or high. In elementary, it fits into the day. It can be many times during the day, in the beginning, after recess, towards the end of the day, to help students regulate, to connect. In middle school, it's often used in advisory. And in high school, there's often a class that is either an A through G or an elective class that students can go into, and some teachers will also do circle in their classroom as well in high school. It's traumatizing to not be able to interact with people except through technology. Screaming over a phone during meetings feels traumatic. Families feeling the pressure to homeschool, students not having the outlet of school, digital divide, or challenges with using technology. Loss of a safe space for some students because school was their safe place. Absolutely. No schools, kids have to stay homes, not be able to see their teachers or be in their presence. Learning new ways to coexist in community can be traumatic. Coexist, I'm sure that means coexist. Students not being able to connect with peers. They might be at home with an abuser. Yep. No drop-ins for snacks and one-on-ones. And those little important connection moments during a school day. Yeah. So just not being in the usual, you know, we're used to being in school. We're used to kind of seeing each other every day. And for that to not happen and for there to be so many unknowns is difficult. It's hard. Lack of technology, internet needed for learning and connection. Absolutely. And that's an equity issue as well that we're going to talk about in a second. Okay, I'm going to continue on, and activity's gotten diminished. Yeah. I want to continue on here. I want to get into circle process and specifically about doing circles online. Okay, so the way we do circle in person when we're together is we sit in a circle. We have a centerpiece, which is a cloth typically, and maybe has some parts of nature on it, or the four elements, a plant or something of that nature, or maybe a battery operated candle, some water, and also some talking pieces, which are often stuffed animals or little squishy things that students like to pass around in the circle. So as we move online, a circle is a very physical thing. We're in each other's presence, and we're not just speaking, we're reading each other's body language. And so to move circle online from a personal space is a challenge. It's a very relational process that really requires us to be together. And so to do this online is really a challenge, and it's not impossible, and we can still do it. And so I'm going to help you think about that right now. In opening, if anyone recalls the opening I did today, it was the breathing, mindful moment, as well as the quote. And so that's something that can translate pretty well. Sometimes in our circles, we'll do like a singing bowl. We'll ring a singing bowl or a chime, or there'll be a bell, and we'll have students close their eyes. And when you don't hear it anymore, when the sound ends, you'll raise your hand. And so that's something that can still be done online as well. We'll do a check-in, and I mentioned this before, check-in can happen in breakout groups. It doesn't have to be, especially if you have a large group of people. If you have 4 or 5 students, you could do a check-in all together. But if you've got a large group of people, a classroom, you can do check-in in breakout groups. Now you have to make sure that your students can understand the responsibilities and the rules around breakout groups. And you have to determine whether that's something that they can handle or not. I'm sure many students can. And then you can go in between breakout groups and check in with some of the students. You can sort of go between different groups of students. So the guidelines I'm going to review in a minute, but the guidelines changed slightly because now we're in an interactive online space rather than personal. And then a big part of Online Circle to Connect is really about providing some sort of game or activity. Now, I'm sure this PowerPoint will be available, this Google slide presentation will be available, and I've added all kinds of links in here for you. This game link here is a link to all kinds of games that can be done on Zoom with students or staff. Up, down, stop, go, I'm going to show you in a minute. That's a game that can happen. And then moving on to what you want to talk about, whatever it is the question is. We'll get into some questions in a minute, or to create some shared values. What do we want our school community values to be as we move online, as we have been doing remote learning, as we've worked together all these past weeks remotely? What values have emerged as something that's important to us? Let's have that conversation as a class. Things of that nature. One of the differences between restorative justice and other sort of just meetings is that it's really values based, and we focus on values. We revisit them if we've already created them, or we co-create them together. It's really important because values speak to people's culture and who they are and where they're from, and that's a way of being responsive in that way. And then a checkout. How was this for you? How's that feel? That kind of thing. And then a closing. Okay. I wanted to show you this because this is a really good way to understand the circle process. And it's important because it shows you how important each element is, right? So if we're thinking about a circle I'm just going to say 1 hour long, just for the purposes of instruction today. And you're going to be moving clockwise through this. You're going to spend the first 15 minutes, if it's an hour circle, getting acquainted, doing an opening, doing a check-in, doing introductions, or reintroducing yourself, or introducing yourself in some way that might be fun, right? Like what's your superpower today, or what, that kind of, I'm sure you have a lot of those intro games you can play. So you'll spend like the first quarter doing that. And then the second quarter is where you get into creating values together, creating shared connection with each other, and going a little bit deeper. And so you've spent really half the time building the foundation for actually having a conversation, right? So that means the addressing issues part, the third quarter there, will go much better. It can go deeper, and because you've created that foundation, you've spent literally half the time together getting to a place relationally and safety-wise, where you can address issues or talk about what you need to talk about. Sometimes they're hard things we need to talk about. Sometimes they're not so hard, and they're just fun things or light things. And then the last part will be, you know, next steps, coming up with a plan, whatever it is that needs to happen, check out, close, that kind of thing. So if you look at it as like a medicine wheel, as if this is broken into, the important takeaway from this is that each part of the circle gets equal parts, and that you're spending approximately half the time just creating the foundation for the conversation instead of just launching right into it. Okay, that's important, and that's one of the big RJ differences. Okay. I talked about guidelines. By the way, I know this is just me talking, and normally in our PDs, I talk very little. So this is very challenging for me, and I'll just be open with you and transparent about that. I'm not used to just being so didactic, but I am also learning how to do this. And so if it's tedious for me to just be constantly talking at you, I just invite you to just bear with it a little bit longer, and hopefully you'll gain something from it. But I wanted to sort of look at some guidelines for online circles and gatherings and how they might be different than in person, right? So this is from a circle that I was in last week, and I'll just, you can just sort of read through it on your own, and you can see what would correspond to being in person and what might correspond to being online. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the use of a talking piece. For those of you that don't know, a talking piece is an object, usually it has some meaning, that goes around the circle, and the person who's holding it is the one that everyone else is actively listening to. And that person who has it has the floor. And it goes around, typically around the left, not always, but usually to the left. That's the side your heart is on. So we typically will pass the left, and it's a way of creating equity or even equality of voice, because some people will speak a lot in meetings, some people will be more reticent or hesitant to speak, and it provides a space where everyone will have their chance to speak or pass. Okay, and as long as you're present, you remain present, you can pass the talking piece if you don't want to say anything. And it alleviates anxiety of like, am I going to be able to get my words out? Am I going to be able to say what I want to say? And so it's really important. We don't pass a talking piece from one part of the circle to the next. It always goes around, because it would defeat the purpose if you're just sort of passing it, when someone wants to talk, sort of tossing it to someone else in the circle. So when you're online, you are not using a talking piece because you can't, obviously can't do that. So you're going to use an invisible talking piece. There's so many creative ways that I'm sure you can think of to use an invisible talking piece. You could simply just call the next person, so whoever has a quote talking piece can just call out the name of the next person they want to pass it to, how their order is on their Zoom, someone who hasn't gone yet. Or you can have something I'm going to show you in a minute, which is a little graphic organizer for who's in your circle. You can pretend that the talking piece is something, you can pretend it's really heavy. You can pretend it's huge. You can pretend it's very light. You can pretend it's an animal. You can get creative with it. Or you can ask each person in your circle to hold something that's special and meaningful to them, and they can even talk about it at that moment, and that's their talking piece for that specific circle. So really the sky's the limit when it comes to talking pieces, with the goal being that the person who has it is the person that is talking and the person that everyone else is focusing on and listening to, okay? This is another slide of some guidelines. This is from one of our RJ facilitators from Elmhurst United. Her name's Gil Sosnick, and she does circles multiple times a week with her students from Elmhurst. And this is one of the slides that she used in multiple languages, and for the guidelines that they use in circle. Okay. speak and listen from the heart, pass the invisible talking piece by calling on someone when you're done sharing, and honor privacy. That's it. That's what she uses. So I just wanted you to give an example. I wanted to show you sort of a real life example there. Here is something that Gil also created, that from a circle that I was in a couple weeks ago with all these people. These are all real folks in the RJ world in OUSD. And this is how we knew who was next. And you can see there's the virtual centerpiece there in the middle, which is nice. And what we did was we kept bringing this slide up over and over through the course of our conversation, so we knew who was next. So after I spoke, as you can see down there around 5 o'clock, Denise knew that she was next because we went around clockwise, okay? And so these are, this is a template where you can just put in names and take out names. Now, of course, it'd be hard to do this with 50 people, right? So you would have to use some other process, but with a smaller group, it worked fine. So let's see. There's going to be some differences when you move Circle online. I would say one of the big ones is that we just talked about talking pieces, but that you're going to want to shorten the Circle, I think. Attention span is smaller or maybe less online. You can use the different features of whatever platform you're using. If it's Zoom, there's polls. You can have people raise their hands, breakout groups, all kinds of other features. One thing that I will say is that one of our folks tried to do Instagram live chat Circle, and it didn't really work. So that's something we learned. We were hopeful to be able to use Instagram, but it was difficult to do a Circle just via chat on Instagram. So I'm not saying it won't work for you, but it didn't really work for that person. And the other thing is to remember that that people are going to be showing video of where they are or not. We ask people to show video because then we can see each other. But when someone does that, we're a guest in their house. And I'm going to talk about equity in a second, but it's important to remember that. And the other thing is that learning styles will be amplified. So if you have a student that has a processing disorder or maybe some challenges with processing, it might be even more exacerbated online. And so just to keep that in mind, all the different learning styles, and that you might want to check in individually with certain students about what's working and not working for them. You probably already do that as a teacher. Anyway, so here's a game. I wanted to show you game. This is another game from Gil Sosnick, RJ facilitator, Elmhurst. This is a game that she used to work for Playworks. This is a game that Playworks does. Playworks has a ton of games. And this is a fun game. And I actually played this game with our RJ staff the other day. And you can do it virtually. You can do it online. So you basically get up from your computer and there's a leader. And when they say up, you reach your hands up towards the sky. When they say down, you reach down and touch your toes. When they say stop, you freeze, and when they say go, you run in place. So it's a good way to get exercise too and get out some energy. And you do that, and then of course the second round is you do the opposite, right? So when I say up, that's when you reach down. When I say down, that's when you reach up, and so forth, right? So this is a fun game you can do with your students. It's pretty easy to understand, and it's something that you can do online with them as a group, and it also gets out some energy. So that's something that you can do. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk a bit about equity because I've been thinking about this because we try to create an equitable atmosphere in our schools. We try to be aware of our biases as adults and how they impact students both negatively and positively. But when it comes to remote learning and distance learning, there's really no way to achieve equity because everybody's at home, or some kids don't even have homes. Some people live with a lot of people and they can't show video, or their house is too chaotic. And there's all kinds of reasons why someone might not be able to show video or even be able to participate because they may not have the technology. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I don't, many of you probably are, more than aware of this. I put a link here just in case you want to read more about it from someone who wrote about this, what they call video classism, bias and video judgment. And I definitely have heard of some bullying going on between students, and so we need to be able to create an environment where that kind of thing is less likely to happen. And also just be aware as adults in this space that it is really, we can do the best that we can to create an equitable environment for our students, and do the best that we can to teach and learn during this crisis. But that also means being aware of equity and being aware of our biases and how they play out, and how our behavior impacts students, and vice versa. So I just wanted to put a little thing in here about that, and then a link for you on your own time. You feel free to click on that when this is available. We're going to be finishing pretty soon here, but when there was a survey that the All City Council did, who is a youth governing body in OUSD. They use restorative practices to build community and deal with harm in their own group, but they also support restorative practices district-wide. They were some of the biggest supporters of not cutting the budget of restorative justice last year when our budget was on the chopping block, so to speak. But there was a survey that they put out to students all over our school district. And one of the questions they asked was, what questions would you like to see in circles? There was hundreds of answers, but I pulled out a few. And so these are direct quotes. I didn't edit them at all. These are direct quotes from students about some of the questions that they had, that they would like to be asked in circle, or that they would like to be in a circle about. I'm not gonna read them all, but you can look through them. So these are some sort of, these might be helpful to you as you engage with your students. These are questions directly from the students, so you can see what they're kind of thinking, and they're good questions. Okay. By the way, the link down here at the bottom that you see, that's the link to this presentation too. So it's on most of the slides, not all of them, but most. I put a few more links on here. One of the things that we found is that it's important for students to have a schedule that's clear for them, that's easy to understand of what Zoom meetings are going to be happening, what circles and when, and not have multiple platforms that they have to be checking. Continue to do nows and check-ins with your students. And these two links here this is a circle a day question randomizer. So many of you may have seen our circle a day question ring that we created, that has questions for circles that are linked to social and emotional learning competencies, right? Like self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, those kinds of things. So Christina Gillen, who is one of our colleagues in the behavioral health unit, she took all those questions and put them in a randomizer, which is a Google spreadsheet that every time you refresh the sheet, a new question pops up. It's a great tool to use for Circle too. You can use those questions. So that's there. And then this link here, relationship and community building questions, is exactly that. It's just a list of all kinds of questions. They're kind of like sentence starters, but for circle questions, right? And these are just some examples of videos teachers have made either on TikTok or other things that they've been able to do. Oops, where am I here? Oh no, that's what happens when you touch the computer by mistake. These are some things that teachers have done using video to share with their students to help humanize them and maintain connection with them, right? And this is another link here of a circle that Gil did. Talked about her a lot because she's just been really helpful in remote learning around moving from being in person to being virtual, and she's been helpful. in terms of that. So this is, I put an example of a community building circle. It's a Google Slides presentation that she did that you can click on that sort of leads you through a circle that she did with some of her students. Okay, and she's at Elmhurst. And that's it. So I really appreciate you all attending and listening to me. We have a couple minutes left. This is our Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. There's my email, our website. And let me just check out the chat here real quick. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of, I would encourage you all to save this chat. There's some great questions in it. The way you would save it would be to click on the three buttons down there. Sort of the three, what do you call those? 3 dots at the bottom of the chat. Anyway, again, I want to appreciate you for Teacher Appreciation Week. I want to thank you very much for attending this webinar and sticking with me. I hope you got something out of it. I hope it was worth your time. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to speak with any of you. I want to support you in doing this work. Together, we can create a culture shift at this district, a paradigm shift. We can move from transactional to relational. We can be in community together. We can connect with each other, and we can create a community of learners. Okay, that's what we're here to do, is create a community of learners. And the important word there is community and, of course, learners. So thank you very much. Kelleth, I don't know what else you need to do to take us out.
Well, David, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for your thoughtful presentation today on restorative justice and how we can use it during this period of distance learning. And just also want to say in general, we really appreciate the work that you and the OUSD RJ team have done over the years, because OUSD has really been a model in the world of education to use restorative justice to rethink how we engage with students in our school communities. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it a lot. And just also want to say thank you to all of the participants today. Thank you for joining and for listening, and thank you for your thoughtful comments. Again, as David has mentioned, we really appreciate you, especially not only during this week, but always. So thank you for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Remember that taking care of yourself is really first priority, and hope that you have a wonderful wellness day on Friday. It's a duty-free day, so you're not required to do any work related to your teaching duties. All right. So thank you very much. And David, unless you have anything else to say, I think we can sign off.